Thank you for joining us for this evening's Town Hall, Your Voice, Your Future, Common Core. All this week we've been telling you in our newscasts about Common Core. Supporters see it as one important answer to the question, how can we fix our public schools? But opponents fear going forward with Common Core amounts to giving up local control of the classroom. This evening we will explore those positions and many more. Now, here's the moderator for Town Hall, Your Voice, Your Future, Common Core, Mark Hyman, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Calvin. For millions of Americans, a high school diploma will be the extent of their formal education. For others, it's the gateway to college and other formal training programs. For others still, they will not graduate. They will never get a high school degree. Good evening, I'm Mark Hyman, host of Behind the Headlines. Tonight we're talking about Common Core. It's a very controversial topic right now. Now, we've got a packed studio audience here ready to get started with a lot of great questions. But you at home can also be a part of this important discussion. I'll tell you in a few moments how you can join us. But as I mentioned a moment ago, we have a lot of anxious folks ready to get started with questions that we want to put to our panel of experts. So let's go ahead and meet them. Joining us this evening is Dan Challoner. He's president of Public Education Foundation. Jared Bigham, PhD. He's director of College and Career Readiness for SCORE. That's the State Collaborative on Reforming Education. Julie West. She's president of Parents for Truth in Education. Mark West. He's president of the Chattanooga Tea Party. I'd like to state that our panelists are here in their personal capacities. The views they represent are their own unless they state otherwise. Additional information on our panelists may be found on our website at newschannel9.com. Now, I mentioned a moment ago we have an audience ready to get started, but you can also be a part of this important discussion. News Channel 9 anchor Latricia Thomas is manning our social media desk. She'll explain how you can be a part of this important discussion. Latricia?
Mark, well, like you said, we've got so many people inside our studio anxious to ask questions about Common Core that so many people feel so strongly about. All we need is you at home, whether you're watching us on this TV, whether you're watching us streaming live on NewsChannel9.com, you can be a part of this discussion, and we want you to. This is how you do it. You can go to our News Channel 9 Twitter page, which is Twitter /NewsChannel9 with the 9 spelled out. You can also go to our Facebook page. Use the hashtag Your Voice, Your Future. That way we can find your question. Ask comments, ask questions, put them to our panelists. That way you can be a part of the discussion and we can get an all-around good talk tonight. Mark.
Thank you, Latricia. Now, this is a town hall. It's all about getting questions asked and answered by our panel of experts. But tonight we're going to start off with a question not of the panel, but of our live audience here. And I'm going to ask a question of my audience. I'd like you to respond with the sound of applause. Your two choices and answers are yes and no. Please respond to this statement. Tennessee schools should implement the Common Core program. Those who believe yes, please applaud. Those who believe no, please applaud. Let me put the same question to our panel of experts by a show of hands. Should Common Core be implemented here in Tennessee? If you believe yes, please raise your hand. If you believe no, please raise your hand. Great. All right, so join me over here, sir. So the audience is probably a little more heavily in favor of Common Core. Our panels is split 50-50. Let's start off with the first question of the evening. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Matthew McNabb. I live in Saudi Daisy, and my question is, Common Core standards were not written by the federal government, but would they be so widely accepted by the states if they were not facilitated as a means of escaping federal mandates under No Child Left Behind or to obtain federal grants under Race to the Top? And where in the Constitution, if anywhere, are the powers granted for these acts?
Let me go ahead and start off with Dan, because there's a couple of things in there. There's certainly No Child Left Behind, which has been in place for about a decade. Then, of course, there's the Race to the Top money, the $4.35 billion that was spent on this. And then how does it fit in with the way we typically do education?
So a couple things to think about there. It's a great question. Obviously, as you said, it's not a federal program. It's a decision that governors made starting in 2008 to join into Common Core or not. I mean, one of the things, there's been a lot of conversation about the impact of Race to the Top on this, but today there are 43 states that are moving forward with Common Core, including Tennessee, and the vast majority of those states did not receive Race to the Top funds. In other words, they may sometimes, they may have been incented to adopt Common Core to get federal grants, but when they didn't get it, they still moved forward with Common Core. And I think the reason they did that is they're responding to what they know to be true, that our public education system needs to be much stronger. So that's part of what I think I would answer that question with. I don't know others.
Julie, looks like you have a response.
I do. Well, the fact is that although 43 states adopted it, that there are a vast majority of those states, I believe all but 5, putting forward legislation to withdraw. The fact is, according to the U.S. Constitution, that all powers that are not specifically granted to the federal government belong to the states. Also, 6 federal acts give the power over education to the states and forbid a national curriculum. The reality is, here in Tennessee, Race to the Top was going to go down in flames, but people were brought into the room to read off county by county how much money each district would lose if they didn't adopt, and they were basically bullied into adopting standards that had never been written. And as to the idea that it was written by people in the state of Tennessee, name one. You can't, because they're copyrighted standards that have actual authors.
Let me follow up with Jared, because there was the issue about the federalization of this, and it was in the original question. What about a national curriculum? Is there a problem with that, or is that a good thing?
I would have a problem with calling it a national curriculum because, first of all, it's a set of standards, not curriculum. Curriculum is how we teach the standards at the local level. And, we have to have consistency state to state, because before we just had an amalgamation of everything under the sun depending on what state you're in. So, it's not a matter of should we or is there anything wrong. Why wouldn't we is the question you should ask, because we need consistency across our country.
The Constitution.
All right. Let me go back to the audience for our next question. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what's your question?
Yeah, hi, my name is John Anthony. I live in Ottawa, a new resident of Tennessee. And Jared, I have a question for you. The whole idea of the Common Core standards is to help kids do better for college and for career. So what is the, I don't know, just the study that was done and maybe just some of the high-level results of that, so some of the data points on it, that say that if we go through the Common Core standards, and my son or my daughter goes through that in fact they're going to be better equipped to go out into the world and get a job. Where would I go to find that?
Well, you mean a specific reference or during the development of the standards, just so I can clarify?
I'm talking about a specific, the development stage. I'm really past that. I'm saying before we ever got there, what did we do? What did we look at that said, you know what, if we take these set of standards, this is actually going to better prepare my son and my daughter to go out into the work world and also do better in a regular college?
Okay, great, okay. Well, when the development of the standards was underway, they were benchmarked against the highest performing countries in the world and some of the most successful states in our country that had some really good standards already. So when we were, wow, I didn't get halfway through, Julie. And so whenever we were developing them, we looked at what was working in other countries where they were outperforming us and where a lot of our jobs were going from our country. And then we looked at states that had some really good standards and we benchmarked them against those, and that helped guide the development process.
Mark, you want to respond?
Yeah, real quickly. I hear about some of the things they said they've done, but the first question I think is the most critical question we need to go back to. Where in the Constitution does it give our federal government the power to do what they are doing? Now, we'll hear from the other side, oh, it was state-led. I would challenge them to define what is state-led. We hear that all the time, Common Core state standards. Let's understand what we mean by state-led. And then finally, also, our Constitution, our founders actually implemented a system that was made up of test tubes, and those test tubes are our states. And those states were put together so that we can all try different ideas and walk away with the best ones. Massachusetts has a great school system, and they've had to lower their standards to meet the Common Core standards. That's not something I would be too proud of.
And I'd like to add in that despite what Jared indicated, they changed the wording on Common Core. They're no longer called benchmarked, which is what we were guaranteed. They are now called informed, that they're not benchmarked by other results, that they've been informed. And we hear about how we're constantly being outperformed by other nations. But the reality is the United States holds half the patents in the world. We still rank #1 in creativity. We still rank #1 in entrepreneurial aspirations. We still rank at the top of the list in the ability to take those dreams and turn them into inventions and ideas. And while the Chinese may do very well on one test, at what cost? Their children have finished their first class by 7:30 in the morning. By high school, they are finishing their last class at 10:30 at night with a 1-hour break for lunch, a 2-hour break for dinner. They have an astronomical academic suicide rate, and there is absolutely no correlation between doing well on that test and anything related to standard of living, and we need to keep that in mind.
Now, we've already had some great questions start off the evening, and we've had some division of opinions on the panel. A lot of folks at home want to be a part of this discussion. Before I check in with social media, I want to get one more question in from our audience here. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what's your question?
I'm Adam Lowe. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Bradley County Commission. We hear constantly that Common Core is simply standards. It's not curriculum. It's not teaching models. However, recently the Brookings Institute released a study that verified many others, saying that rigor of standards in states does not constitute or account for any variance in performance from students. In other words, low-performing schools in Massachusetts are just as low-performing as those in Louisiana. For proponents, what makes Common Core different than 30 years of failed standards and rigor? And for the opponents of Common Core, what reforms might this be getting in the way of?
And Dan, I want to go with you on this. And if I just broaden the question from it, even though we're talking about Common Core, it's probably fair to say in the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a concern across the country about where we are education-wise. A lot of programs have been implemented and haven't worked. Is this the one that might move us in the right direction? And if so, why?
So I don't think there's one reform, one change that's going to move our nation and our kids to a whole nother level. It's a number of things. There's plenty of research that says 3 or 4 things really matter. One is standards. And I think if you look around the world as well, around states, you mentioned Massachusetts, but that's the highest performing state in our nation, and 15 years ago they had very high standards. So I think there's evidence, Massachusetts being one, the importance of high standards. The other pieces are equally important, and I think sometimes in this huge debate about standards, what really matters is teaching. Teaching, and anybody who's a parent knows how important a great teacher is. So that's part of what the reforms have to be. We work with teachers every day. And what we hear from teachers every day is how important the Common Core standards are, because they actually reduce the number of standards. Somebody, I think it's, I've read a number of times, Tennessee had 120 standards in 4th grade math before this. They'll have 40. So there are fewer standards. It'll allow teachers to go deeper, but also the standards are raised. So what you're doing is enabling teachers to really engage kids in learning. And I think the combination of high standards and allowing teachers to engage kids. As a parent, what I want are my kids to be engaged in the classroom. Those are some of the key. I won't go on and on about the things we know, but teaching and standards are critically important. So back to your question, I don't think it's one thing, but standards are a very important thing. And if you look at the states that are doing well in this country and have done well for a while, they have one thing in common. They have high standards. Tennessee, for a very long time, has had some of the lowest standards in the country. The gap between what we said we were doing for our kids and what we're actually doing was maybe the largest in the nation. So I think we have to deal with that and raise our standards.
I want to bring Mark back in the discussion. And Dan just made a comment a moment ago about 120 standards approximately in the state of Tennessee. Why shouldn't there be more uniformity so children in Knoxville who move to Memphis would fall into the same kind of school curricula? Isn't that a good thing?
Well, first of all, standards are a good thing. No one's going to say, let's throw out all the standards. The issue we're doing right here today, though, is what I would suggest should have happened 10 years ago or 5 years ago. What happened, though, was in some dark room, and I'm being a little facetious, but in the back room, you had governors and through an NGA, National Governors Association, you had other private groups, private organizations, significantly funded by Bill Gates to come up with these, quote, standards that now are going to apply across the board to everyone. Now, I hear quoted frequently, well, this will enable us, if someone's in New York and they move to California, then everything will be equal. Well, first of all, I continue to say this and no one responds on the other side. This is unconstitutional what's being done, and it's illegal. They're violating Congress statutes, okay, congressional statutes. No one talks about that. Okay, but additionally, we have about 2% of our 50 million children that move across state lines, okay? So we're talking about turning upside down our entire system and violating the Constitution and violating federal law to supposedly get a standardized system.
I want to bring Jared back into this conversation. So, well, if it's illegal or unconstitutional, is there a lawsuit or should there be a lawsuit? Or, I'm a news guy. I haven't heard of one. But
well, I'm very happy. Nobody answered your question. I'm very happy to answer it, Mark. In 2009, 48 governors and 48 chief school officers, which is equivalent to our Commissioner of Education, signed a memorandum of understanding to come together and create these standards. The federal government wasn't there. It was 48 states that signed the memorandum of understanding to develop the standards. And you know, as a principal who had an elementary school in the southeast corner of Tennessee, and I could throw a rock and hit the Georgia line and throw a rock and hit the North Carolina line, it depended on the time of year and the grade level of the student that transferred into my school, whether they were behind, ahead, or not even in the same universe. So you can't sell to me that there's not value in having consistency from state to state, because I've lived it. I've taught it.
Now, before I know it, a lot of our panelists want to get in this discussion. A lot of our audience members want to continue on with a lot of questions. But our viewers at home also want to join the discussion. So let's check in with our social media desk. Latricia, what do you have for us?
Mark, we have a lot of people asking questions already. And the way that you at home can get involved in this discussion, you can go on our Twitter page, on our News Channel on Facebook page. Use the hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture. We have social media people both up here on the desk and behind the scenes scouring those questions to make sure we get your questions asked. The first one we're going to ask tonight comes to us from Amy Freeman, and she asks, I would like someone who has read the Common Core in its entirety to tell us what it says about the texts our children are required to read. So this dealing with the curriculum question and goes back to a lot of parents being confused about what their kids will actually face in school. We're going to pose that question. We're going to go to one more question from Bethany Trulio, who writes, what is so wrong with the education of the previous generations who pioneered the science and technology that we have today, that our children must learn an alternate method? Mark?
Thank you, Latricia. Well, let's go with that first question. I want to bring Julie back into the discussion. So you have concerns. I mean, what are they based on?
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what a senator from Georgia testified when he was testifying at the Common Core hearings. He said the reason their state was looking at pulling out is because when you look at the exemplars, and of course I'm sure Jared would say, but those aren't required, but there are no other options, and it's what will be on the test. So in order to get the scores you need, it's what you need to teach. And as their chief law enforcement officers began to go down the list, that they determined that normally exposing a child to this kind of content, dreaming in Cuban, the bluest eyes, those types of things, it would normally result in felony obscenity charges, but they're not sure what to do because it's going to be on Common Core reading lists. And we're not talking about banning books. We're saying the government doesn't have the right to mandate that our children read textbooks or read books that would normally be considered at least borderline pornographic.
Dan, do you have concerns?
Just a couple of things. First of all, Common Core does not require, I think there are only about 3 texts. One is a Shakespearean play of a teacher's choice, and then the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. I doubt any one of us in this room thinks that students shouldn't be reading those texts. What I would hope very much, and I know I wasn't supposed to do it, but I have a phone with me, and download Common Core, commoncore.org, and you can go and read all of the standards. 2 years ago, I'm not tech savvy enough to do this with a camera rolling, but if you do that, you can pull up all of the standards and you won't find any required reading. You will find a lot of suggested, Appendix B, you'll find a lot of suggested text, but I think what's really important for all of us to keep in mind is there is no curriculum here. This is left entirely to teachers to reach standards that will be much higher than what we've had, but there are no required texts.
Actually, if I can hop in on that, part of the argument for Common Core, like Jared said, is that way children all across the nation will be learning the same things at the same time, so kids can move from Tennessee to Georgia to North Carolina to California without ever missing a beat. Well, it's nonsensical then to say that they won't have the same books, that they won't be studying the same content. And by the way, I'd also say no one up here is a curriculum expert. But it's important to note, well, it's important to note, actually, I would say no, you're not, because you don't write it professionally. You didn't write these standards.
I have a master's in curriculum, if that counts.
Well, but the people who were brought in, the doctor, to review them, who were paid to sign off on the tests, the standards, testified against their own interests and refused to sign off on them, Sandra Stotsky and James Milgram, because they said the standards were inferior. And in fact, since Common Core, we don't even have pre-calculus standards, that they've lowered the math standards.
All right, I want to bring Jared back in the discussion. And quick follow-up question. Jared, is the problem with the Common Core state standards, or is the problem with the informing the public and let's call it the messaging so that questions are answered? Is it perhaps that maybe it wasn't done properly with an informed public?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. And I'll say, in all the discussions I've had, I've never had anyone point to a standard and say, I don't want my child learning that. That's bad. There's some kind of hidden agenda here. In September, our Senate Education Committee read all the standards verbatim, grade level to grade level, in English and math. It was one of the most monotonous experiences of my life. But Julie was there, and we read them into the record, and anyone over that 6-hour period had an opportunity to raise their hand and say, I have a problem with that standard. No one did. And so it's really a political issue and a messaging issue more than a standards issue, because you've noticed a lot of what we've talked about up here is not English and math. We've talked about the 30,000-foot view of the creation of the standards or the perception of the standards. So academically, you're hard-pressed to find anyone who just has a problem with the standards themselves.
All right, Julie, hold that thought for a moment, because I'm going to get back to the audience. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
I'm Edna Varner. I live around the corner on Highway 58. And I'm a retired teacher, and since retirement, I have worked in Massachusetts, I've worked in New York, and I've worked in Kentucky and seen the implementation of implementation of Common Core. Here is my question. I've been to a number of these forums, and in them, there's a lot of talk about government, a lot of talk about constitutionality. What I don't hear a lot of talk about is what is actually happening to children in schools where the Common Core is being implemented. I've had a chance to talk with parents, talk with teachers in those schools, talk with principals, and they like high standards. I would like to hear some conversations about how we walk away having high standards for our students and public support for them. I don't care whether the children I know move to other states. Right here in Tennessee, I'd like to know that the education they're getting makes them competitive, makes them have the kind of lifestyle and all of the opportunities of any kid in this nation. So I'd like to hear some conversation about what you understand is happening to children in schools where the Common Core is being implemented.
And before we get an answer to your question, you've been to other forums, none of them nearly as good as what we're doing here at NewsChannel 9, correct?
Not as good as these. I've heard a lot of misinformation in those forums. We're doing better.
All right, we're doing the truth here at NewsChannel 9.
Some skewed information in this
All right, well, let's bring Mark back into the conversation.
Yeah, great question, ma'am, and you actually put the focus where the focus needs to be, on the children. And I just happened to bring a letter along from a parent from Bradley County who was sent to us. I won't give her last name. Her first name's Cynthia. This is what she had to say about how it's affecting her children. I'm the parent of 3 children, aged 11, 13, and 15. My youngest is struggling badly in math and reading. Now, that being said, that was not always the case. All of our children were A, B students up until they entered the 3rd, 4th, and 6th grade. Why? Can you say Common Core? My 13 and 15-year-old children took 2 years to just catch up. They were so disgusted with school, it was a nightmare. Now, this goes on, and I certainly could put this on our website for you to read it and remove the personal information, but you're exactly right, ma'am. This is about the children, and who should decide what those children should learn, and who should decide what those standards should be. And I would suggest the state is not some boogeyman up there. The state is you and me. The state is all the people in this audience. The state is everyone living out there. And I'm going to ask you, did you have any say-so on these standards? Did you? Or was it some NGA organization, as we've heard said, 48 governors, and Bill Gates, and all these people? Did you have any say-so on that? I would venture to say you didn't know about Common Core until just in the last several years when it was already done. It was done to you before you had a say-so in it. And that's how we have an impact on our children, is by having a say-so individually in the future of our children and the formulation of these standards.
Before I get Dan to do a follow-up, I would just want to remind my audience here and our panelists, if you can keep your questions and answers a little shorter so I can get to as many questions as possible, I'd appreciate it. But Dan, can I ask you for a follow-up, bring you back into the conversation?
Sure. I think the point about how important this is for kids is exactly where the focus should be. We work with teachers all the time, and what teachers will tell you is the standards, by allowing teachers not to try and do 10,000 things in a week or a month, but actually to really focus on high standards, allow kids to learn much more. I'm sure that parent's experience is valid for that parent, but by and large, teachers and parents agree that the higher standards allow much better learning.
And by the way, just out of curiosity for my audience here, just by a sound of applause, if you are a current or retired teacher or school administrator, would you please applaud? Right. So we have good representation from teachers here. Let's join this gentleman. Sir, please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
All right, my name is Ron Harr, and I live in the Rivermont area.
And you have a position here in the community as well.
I'm also the president and CEO of the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. So I worry every day about bringing jobs to our community. I saw a few years ago where Tennessee got an F from a national organization for our truth in advertising about the preparedness of our children in this state. That moved up dramatically 2 years ago because we started comparing ourselves to other states and to other countries by setting higher standards. So my question is, how can setting higher standards, when it's proven, even here in Tennessee, to have improved our education of our children so much, how can that be a bad thing? And if people are opposed to it, what do they offer in place of it?
Julie?
If the standards are so much higher, and if the governor is proud of the results, then why did he start talking about test scores over 4th of July week when no one was paying attention? And why is he delaying posting scores until after the primary elections? Because he knows no one would survive it. The reality is, if the standards are nothing more than a things to do list, why are they costing us $500 million? If the standards are so popular with teachers and families, why do we have a record number of teachers retiring? Why do we have homeschooling growing at 10 times the rate of public education? And why were 88 Tennessee legislators afraid to go home last session without having an opportunity to vote against Common Core? The reality is, the Article 1 of the Tennessee Constitution says it is incumbent upon the people to instruct our government as to how to rule. And the people have spoken loudly and clearly. Again, 88 members of the Tennessee House knew that they couldn't go home without voting against it. That in and of itself should be enough. That we've got doctors saying that they're having to prescribe record amounts of antidepressants for first and second graders. It's obscene, and it needs to stop.
Mark, I think it's very important to point out that our legislators left session with Common Core completely intact
because of faulty fiscal notes and trickery. The vote was 88 legislators voted against it. And by the way,
I give our policymakers more credit than being tricked.
So you don't think
I give them more credit.
think that the legislators of the state, 88 of them voted against it, and that wasn't enough.
I want Jared to get in and complete his thought.
Yeah, I would just say that we left the session with Common Core intact. Our policymakers did not pass any legislation to delay Common Core, to repeal Common Core. We left with, matter of fact, Julie, one of your statements to me earlier is Common Core is stronger in Tennessee than any other state in the South.
Well, that's pitiful. Actually, I said we are the only southern state with it still intact, and that is for a very limited period of time. But again, 88 legislators knew they could not go home in an election year without voting against it. And back to the point about the governors getting together and signing this into being, the executive branch, and you should know as an educator, does not have the legal authority to draft legislation. That belongs to legislators. Nobody voted for this, and the way it was put upon its people was illegal.
All right, I want to make sure I get Jared an opportunity to complete his thought, and then I have to check in with our visitors, our viewers at home, because they want to be a part of this discussion as well. But go ahead and complete your thought.
Well, the continuation was that to address what Mark said about kids being frustrated and the high numbers of antidepressants and all this stuff. Kids have been frustrated in school since Horace Mann was teaching in one-room schoolhouses however long ago. I mean, being frustrated in school isn't anything new. Now, do I empathize, sympathize? Yes, I'm a parent. I've been around the kitchen table, and it's frustrating sometimes, but there's growth in the struggle. And if our students aren't struggling a little bit, then we're not challenging them enough. Now, I don't want any kid to go home in tears, but we've got to push them. And Julie said she was praying for me earlier, so I'm going to get biblical too. The Bible says you got to break the seed a little bit before it's going to grow, before it's going to sprout. So we've got to push kids out of their learning comfort zone.
Provoke not your children to wrath.
Well, it's not the 4th of July, but we already have some fireworks here in the studio. Let's see what our viewers think of all of this at home. So let's check in with our social media desk. Latricia, what's the latest?
Mark, we have a lot of people weighing in on our Twitter page. You can do that too just by going to the News Channel 9 Twitter page and use the hashtag Your Voice, Your Future. Ask your question. We'll do the best we can to get it in front of our panelists. 2 questions we've received tonight. The first one is from Gary Akins, and he says, how does this possibly hamper creativity in students? Creativity we've heard a little bit about here tonight. Our second question we're going to get from our viewers at home. This is from Stephanie Lehman via our Twitter page, and she asks, teachers are required to use research-based methods. Why is Common Core not required to be research-based as well? 2 good questions there, Mark.
All right, well, I want to follow up with the first question. And again, News Channel 9 is not taking a position in this debate. We have seen comments from teachers on both sides of the discussion, those who favor it, those who don't. One of the themes we've seen, and to follow up this first question, from teachers who have concerns about it, some say it reduces their creativity and their ability to work with certain kinds of students, those who may need more help. Is that a true statement? Is that a true concern? And Dan, what perhaps could be done about it if that in fact is correct?
So what we see is just the opposite, that Common Core is allowing teachers to engage creativity more. I think the problem of the last 10 years has been too many standards and an assessment that is basically choosing a couple of answers from A, B, C, or D. Maybe a story would be helpful. A couple days ago, I had to do an errand at Walgreens. Walked in, person ahead of me was a teacher, a wonderful teacher who had taught my 2 kids in math. And I told him I was going to be on this panel, and I said, honestly, what do you think about Common Core? And he looked at me and he said, really? And I said, yeah, I really want to know. You're a teacher I really respect. He said, it's what I've been waiting for 20 years. We're finally moving past a time when kids are doing really simple rote memorization. We're actually giving them the tools to solve real problems, to read, to work together to solve problems. I've been at work 25 years. I've never yet been asked by my boss to choose A, B, C, or D. It just doesn't happen out in the real world. That's how we assess kids these days. We're moving past that with Common Core. Teachers will tell you. Now, moving to Common Core has been an enormous lift for teachers. And I think we have to all recognize how hard a challenge this is for our teachers and how much support they need. But moving there will tap into the creativity, into the innovation. what has made America great is tapping into that creativity and innovation, and that's one of the great values of Common Core.
I want to get a response from Mark. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I hear a lot of discussion over on the other side about how teachers are really in favor of this. One thing that people need to know is that the NEA was strongly opposed to this and issued a real concern. In fact, I'll quote the NEA president when he said that 70% of teachers believed implementation is going poorly in their schools, and 2/3 report that they've never been asked to give their input on how to introduce the new standards. That's the NEA. And secondly, the same type of sentiment from the New York City Teachers Union as well. So we've got some different views out there amongst the teachers directly in what you're hearing on this panel.
So Mark, you said before we started that if there was misinformation, it needed to be countered. There is a union head who said exactly what was just repeated. The NEA also did a poll of teachers, of 4,000 teachers in the fall, and 73% of them either strongly supported Common Core or generally supported it. Very consistent with a poll of 10,000 teachers done by Scholastic. Again, about 72%. Education Next out of Washington did a very scientific poll of 1,000 teachers, 76%. So yes, the union heads may be saying one thing, but teachers are saying something very different.
Teachers in Chicago and New York.
Okay,
let's talk about Tennessee teachers.
I start to say, I'm not all too concerned about New York and Chicago teachers. I'm concerned about Tennessee teachers.
Who are retiring in record numbers.
And secondly, there's a big difference between the standards themselves and implementation of the standards. So if the NEA wants to say implementation is going bad in this state or that state, that's a state issue. That's not a standards issue. That's an implementation issue.
All right, and before I go back to the audience, I just want to follow up with a question from the moderator. Some of the things we've seen here at News Channel 9, are there concerns by people parents who send their children to private parochial school and homeschool? So quickly, both Jared and Julie, I want you to weigh in. I'll start with Julie. Should parents of private parochial school students and homeschooling parents be concerned about this? And if so, why? But brief answer.
Absolutely, because the way they're going to enforce this, the way they're beginning to enforce this, is David Coleman, who is behind the development of the standards, who really wasn't qualified, but he is now over the College Board and over the AP test and over the SAT and ACT. So basically, parents pulled their children out of public schools to save them from what's happening in the schools. And now the government, through one way or another, not just the College Board, but also saying, by the way, we're going to need you guys to take these tests. We're going to need you to fall in line. Well, there is no question that homeschool students are very high achieving students nationwide overall, and private school students. But when the government follows parents into their homes and says, you rejected this in our school, and we're going to force you to do this even though you object to it. We're going to force you to follow these standards. It's unfair, and it's un-American, and it's simply wrong, and they can't say that it's not happening because it absolutely is, which is why there's a battle amongst private and homeschool curriculum companies about which ones are going to fall in line with the standards, because what are kids going to do about the tests?
I want to get Jared with a follow-up. Should parents of private parochial schools and homeschool parents be concerned about this?
I wouldn't be concerned if I knew that my child was going to be ready for multiple opportunities when they graduated. I mean, I would be happy that there was some consistency in the standards, not just within the homeschooling network, but across the country.
So
there's going to be some consistency.
Choice. There's no choice in America anymore.
Before we had Common Core standards, we had the SAT, we had the ACT, we had these national assessments that were there before Common Core standards came into place. So what were homeschool parents teaching before that?
The tests were not directly aligned with the standards. The man
Heaven
who
forbid
wrote the
our
standards,
assessments align with the standards. Oh my goodness.
Well, there's a problem. Actually, many educators, and you can make it a joke if you want, but many people who really care about education think it is morally wrong to teach to a test.
All right, let me move on from there, although I just want to make one correction so the public is aware, the audience is aware. College Board does have the SAT and and AP exams. ACT is a separate and is not part of College Board. So I want to make that one distinction. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
I'm Kim Carson. I do the morning show at Sunny 92.3, and we put this question out this morning. We're partners with NewsChannel 9 and asked our listeners, and it was definitely a hot topic with our listeners this morning, so we brought questions. And one of them was about individual children. Don't these Common Core standards assume that all students learn at the same rate and have equal access to opportunities in life?
That's a great question. I want to put to Mark. How does this fit in with the real world? Is it an appropriate fit, or do you have concerns that maybe doesn't quite work with the reality of differences in family structures and children and learning and so forth?
Absolutely. It is a real concern. Not every child learns the same way, and of course, if you establish standards that are equal and the same across the board, then you're going to run into the challenges in that regard for special needs children particularly. I do want to go back to one thing, though, that was said just on the last question. My good friend is Michael Ferris. He's the founder of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in America. He represents over 100,000 homeschoolers, and they've been warning their homeschool students about the threat and danger of Common Core. Sure, it seems to be a government program, but the reality is, as was just suggested by Julie, David Coleman now leads and is revamping the SAT to align with the standards. Now, he made a big joke. Oh, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is, if I have a building here that says it's open to everyone, anyone that wants to come into this building is open to come, but I have the key, and I'm only going to give the key out to the people who happen to align with these standards. And if you are a homeschooler and you're not teaching to those standards, and you can't pass the SAT because it's been aligned with those standards, all of a sudden you don't have the key to the college. And so you make lightly about aligning assessments and standards, but I would challenge you to take a shot at homeschoolers and their learning capability. They are among the elite across America, and yet we're now passing Common Core standards that are going to probably lock them out of colleges that they want to go to into the future.
Dan, let me follow up, because Mark mentioned something and it raises a good question. We'll talk about, let's say, the group that's sort of in the middle, the pack, the students who kind of work together, and there's a group who exceed that average or exceed the group, and there's ones who fall behind. What is there in Common Core that would help those who fall behind? Is there something specific that would work well for them to bring them up?
So I just think we're getting confused again. Common Core is a set of standards. It says at the end of 4th grade, you're supposed to be at this level, at the end of 5th grade. I just want to make sure we understand that. So in the hands of a great teacher, that's why this is challenging. A teacher has to move the child who is behind, perhaps, as well as challenge the child who's already achieved that standard. That's the art and mystery and magic of great teaching. It's a huge challenge, but that's what great teachers have always done. That's the challenge of it. But it's not suddenly a new thing because of Common Core. Common Core is simply defining where kids need to be. And I want to emphasize this because I think an earlier question mentioned it, and we kind of ran past that. These are higher standards. These are standards that are higher than we've ever had in the state of Tennessee, but they're benchmarked with what's going around in the world and where we have to get as a nation. I'm a parent. I've got 3 kids who are approaching looking for jobs. I want to see them get jobs. Every parent wants their kids to have opportunities. We have to have higher standards. And if we don't, this is a magical moment in this region where all this opportunity, whether it's VW or hundreds of other small companies that have come in here looking for well-educated kids. But the reality is they're going to hire great employees. We want them to be our kids, not kids from some other part of the country or some other nation. We finally have a set of standards that are benchmarked and as high as any standards in the world.
Okay.
We can't roll backwards.
All right.
They are benchmarked internationally and nationally.
All right, we're getting down to the last 15 minutes, so this is kind of our lightning round. Shorter questions, shorter answers. I want to get a question in here, and then also I'm going to check in again with Latricia after that. But please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
My name is Onika Monroe, and I'm an educator here in Chattanooga. And my question is, with these higher standards, what skills are we giving our students, and how are we supporting the teachers to give rigor in the classroom?
Well, I challenge, they're simply not higher standards. In fact, Fordham Institute, that was paid by the folks behind the standards, had to acknowledge that our English standards were higher before. We no longer, under Common Core, have pre-calculus standards, and if we really want higher standards, I challenge anyone in this room to take an 8th grade matriculation exam from the state of Tennessee from 100 years ago, because I doubt, as brilliant as Jared is, that even he would pass it. That the reality is the most literate society in world history was colonial America, when the standards were as local as the kitchen table and the school marm. And the closer you get the standards to the parents, to the children, to the teachers, and the more you move the administration out of the way, the better children do.
Unfortunately, in colonial America, we have more information in the Wall Street Journal right now than they probably had in all the textbooks combined in a colonial America school. So just let me finish one topic without jumping out of your chair.
Start telling the truth, then, Jared.
And when you're talking about having a higher standard, you say Massachusetts had higher standards than us. I'm not worried about Massachusetts. I'm worried about what Common Core does for Tennessee, and it's so far and above what we had in this state. I challenge you, okay, if you don't like Common Core, then what's your plan B? What do we go to? The standards that had us 47th in the country? Because those weren't working.
Okay, as we're in our lightning round, I want to bring in both.
You said you would keep
Dan
it
and
honest. I think it's really important that that's not what Fordham said. Fordham said the math Common Core standards were much higher than what Tennessee had, and English, the Common Core was a little bit higher, not a little bit lower.
And actually, that's not accurate. But once again, they were never benchmarked. They're simply labeled informed now.
All right, and I want to bring Mark in the conversation, and then I'm going to have to check with social media as well.
You know, we keep getting off the key point, folks, and the key point is, again, did any of you had a say-so in these standards? Now, you're interested in your children's education. I would dare say more than Jared is, more than Dan is, more than any of us are. You are more interested in your children's education, but you had zero say-so in this. And I would say, yeah, if our results are poor in Tennessee, do we have to go to Washington? Can we not go to Nashville? Can you not go sit down at Panera Bread with your legislator right here in Chattanooga? Of course you can. I say, again, as Julie said, you know, local is better than national, and we're relying on the big government Common Core standards that came national, came through Bill Gates, who stands to gain. He's worth $80 billion. He stands to gain substantially more if we go down this path.
Well, if you were looking for a kumbaya moment, you're not going to find it here tonight. But maybe some of our viewers at home have found that moment. So let's check one of the social media desks. Latricia, what's the latest?
Well, Mark, we have seen a lot of discussion on our Twitter page. More than 100 questions actually have been asked there. We're going to put a few quick ones in front of you now. The first one from Pat Mallard over Twitter. She says, my granddaughter passed 3rd grade but failed the testing from Common Core. She finally passed after 4 tests. How is this helping her? Our next question comes from Debbie Antoinette Kelly, has a more local question. She says, are the Common Core standards the problem, or is it the specific way that Hamilton County has chosen to implement them? And then finally, our last question from this round, Monica Daniel on Twitter says, why was Common Core implemented before it was tested on a small group? I feel like my child is a test subject. Mark?
You know, I want to follow up with the whole issue in the first question regarding testing. And I want to ask both Dan and Julie to weigh in on this. There's been some arguments made that when it comes to national testing, that if you don't include students who have English as a second language, those who don't have learning issues, that if you take them out of the mix, that our test results actually skyrocket rather high, and that our students maybe as a group may be performing better than we give them credit for. Does that sound valid to you?
Well, I can say that it's not just that, it's children of poverty. We've got one of the highest child poverty rates in the world. And we can have that kumbaya moment and celebrate and say, okay, let's take our children of poverty out and our students with learning disabilities out, and we're #1 in the world, because we are. You take those demographics out, we're #1 in the world. But the reality is, we educate all our children. It doesn't matter what demographic they're in. So we owe it to them to have the same high expectations as we do for the kids that are A+ students.
Do you agree with that, Julie?
Well, the reality is that the other nations that we're supposed to be competing against in these tests, that they don't include those students. And that the reality is once again, what we are teaching now doesn't come close to what was taught 150 years ago, when you had to have calculus, you had to have astronomy, you had to be fairly proficient in ancient languages to even be admitted to high school. You had to have classical logic down in order to be admitted. So you can't poo-poo what they did, because they wrote and achieved some amazing things that, quite frankly, most college students today couldn't do. And in fact, what Common Core has done, the whole idea of college readiness, they simply redefined college ready as a non-selective 2-year community college.
All right. And again, I want to remind everyone, I'll keep it to our lightning round. I want to get as many more questions in as possible. I know you have something to weigh in on, Jared, and we'll get back to you in a moment. But please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what's your question?
My name's Teresa Wood. I live in St. Elmo here in Chattanooga, and I'm also the secretary of the Hamilton County Republican Party. And one of my questions is, how does Common Core address the core problem with our schools that I've seen since I've lived here in Chattanooga and across the country? And that's parental apathy and non-involvement of the parents in the child's education. And it's also the socioeconomic problem that Common Core is going to have to address in order to change any kind of test scores. And also, since we all pay our taxes, we are all invested in these schools. So how does Common Core justify taking the parents and the community out of the decision, since we're the ones that fund it?
All right. And it's actually, the whole topic is a great one, because we're talking about the school standards, but certainly another important component in all of education is the home. Right, Jared?
Yeah, I agree. I'd love to answer both those questions, and I want to agree with Julie in a minute. That was going to be our kumbaya moment. But I'll say the Common Core standards do nothing to improve parent apathy or engage parents, because they're a set of standards. The second part of your question about having input, Mark's brought this up several times about, as Tennesseans, community members, we should have input on creating our standards. To be honest, we've gone through a stack of standards changes in Tennessee that Michael Jordan couldn't jump over in the past 30 years. In my career, we've had 4 standards changes alone, and we don't seek public input on that. We might in the review process, but not in the development process. You go to experts in education to do that. And that's the way it's always been for state. If somebody's designing a new car, I don't want to be involved in that, because I know nothing about designing a car. I wouldn't ride in a car I designed. So I don't want to give input on that. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't have community feedback, but when we're developing standards, people go to school to learn how to do that. And the educators who are implementing know how to do that. So community feedback's fine, but community members developing standards, I don't see that, Mark. I mean, I don't see how we could do that.
Mark?
I don't think you meant to just say this, but you just said all the people out here who are not experts are not qualified to weigh in on the education of their children.
No, I said you could
I don't think
feedback.
you meant to say that, but that's what you
that's
did say.
That's because I didn't say that.
Yes, you did say
Yes,
that. Okay, and there's no one that cares about my children's education and these people's education more than them, not the expert. The expert, sure, they went to school, and it's a process for them, but it's a life to these people, okay? So I would challenge you on that.
I'm glad. I want to clarify. I said that public feedback and review, just like the Common Core standards, were online for review for 2 months and had over 10,000 comments on the website.
We're going to change the entire standards of the entire country based on feedback for 2 months.
Isn't it amazing that we're all able to come together like that?
We've had more discussion in here tonight over Common Core standards than Chattanooga ever had for the last 5 years before Common Core standards was implemented.
Once again, Mark, you're talking about the political view. I'm talking about the academic view of the standards, so we're on different pages here.
And I'm going to have to get back.
Standards are lower.
And panelists, I'm going to have to get back to our audience, and thank you very much for that plug for News Channel 9. We certainly appreciate it. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and what is your question?
I am Daniel Willard from Red Bank, and my question is...
Are you a student right now?
Yes, sir.
In what grade?
11th.
Going into 11th grade?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
My question is, how will Common Core be eased onto the current high schoolers to mitigate the initial drop in the grades of students as Common Core is implemented into our school system?
I know there's been some discussion here in the state about test scores and so forth. Julie, is there a concern about where the test scores are?
Well, absolutely, because the governor held a press conference with the Commissioner of Education the week of 4th of July when no one was paying attention, and apparently they're going to be posted after the primary elections when everyone feels like they're safe. But really, that why don't parents have the right to see their children's raw scores right now? And I'll also say, Jared talked about how many times the standards have changed, even in his career. How many parents, how many citizens know the name of one single other standard other than Common Core? They've gone along, they've done okay, but this one, the people of not just Tennessee, but the nation find so offensive that not only do they know the name, they're showing up at the Capitol and telling the legislators, you'd better get rid of this if you want to keep your job.
All right, Dan, so if it's accurate that some of the scores have gone down, if it's accurate that the standards are higher and the scores have gone down, that would not be unexpected. Is that maybe something we should anticipate and is okay?
So first, I want to try and answer the young man's question, and I admire a young man coming and asking a question about his education, and I think it's important to try and answer his question. The issue of higher standards is going to actually challenge kids a lot more. It's the challenge to teachers to make sure that kids are learning more and achieving at a higher level. It's a reach for everybody. For the specific question that the young man asked, we're getting lost again. Common Core is not a test. It's a set of standards. So you're talking about tests. We're talking about
that
Common Core.
The standards.
The TCAP is not aligned. But I think for the young man, the thing we have to do as concerned parents and schools is to make sure our teachers and our kids have the support to meet the higher standards so that he'll achieve at a level that gives every possible option for his life.
All right, we're just about out of time, so let's go to this gentleman. Please tell us who you are, where do you live, and where's your question?
Yes, my name is Joe Boshears. I am a professor at Chattanooga State. And my question is, I just finished up my first year teaching at Chattanooga State. Before that, I taught 7 years in the Hamilton County school system. I don't know where you're getting your information, Mr. West, but every single teacher that I've spoken with, they're excited about the standards. Now, they have questions about implementation.
I'm running out of time, so you have to get right to your question.
I want to know this. Those teachers that are excited about the standards because they're going to have more freedom in the classroom to implement those standards, what are you going to say to those teachers that are excited about the freedom they're going to have if you do away with Common Core and you start over at ground zero?
I'd be glad. And I have 15 seconds on a response from two panelists, so Mark, please.
Okay, be glad to answer that question. Let's presuppose that these teachers are ecstatic, 100%. And let's presuppose that the parents are totally disgusted, 100%. What matters? What's the critical point here? I think the critical point is we need to have this discussion now. We need to discuss whether or not this was a good move, and we need to come to some grip of reality here that this particular discussion has not occurred. It's now occurring, and overwhelmingly, citizens, parents are opposed to this particular
And
standard.
I'm going to ask Jared for about a 20-second follow-up.
I'll say that we're in our 4th year of implementing these standards, and all we've done is grow as a state on national assessments.
That's false.
And as a quick follow-up to that, do national assessment of educational progress, do they show that nationally and here in Tennessee we're
We
doing
grew
better?
21.8 points in 1 year, which shattered the previous record of any state in the history of the nation.
Based on the previous standards.
Okay, I'm going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time. You know, education, as many people here have already mentioned, is so critical, so important. Certainly Mark addressed it. Every parent has concerns about their child. We certainly want our children to learn the basics, the 3 R's, of course, but we also want more than that. We want math problems solved, historical facts memorized, books read, diplomas granted. We want the best for our children, whether they're moving on to the global community or they're staying here in our local neighborhoods and taking jobs and continuing their education otherwise. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us tonight for this very important discussion. We certainly expect to hear a lot more comments in the days and weeks ahead. We certainly like to thank our panelists for their involvement. All of you at home who've added your comments and questions throughout the evening, certainly continue to watch News Channel 9 tonight for coverage of tonight's town hall and all the day's breaking news, and also continue the discussion on Facebook.com/WTVC News Channel 9. We want to hear from you. We'll continue discussion all week long on this particular topic. As always, we salute our military, our law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, and other emergency personnel for everything they do. I'm Mark Hyman. Good night.
Had a table to throw around.